Let's see.
Can I ask a question?
Mhm.
Allison, this is a paperback edition we're talking,
Yes, that's right.
right? Not just
It's
a
a,
reprint
yeah, no,
with the new blog, right?
it's a paperback edition. We also apparently have a Polish edition as well. I'm assuming it says why Sinead O'Connor Matters, but I can't say for sure. That just came yesterday. But yeah,
Best thing ever. That's great.
This is the paperback with the new epilogue.
Well, Polish Pope and all.
I know, I know. I think this is I've gotten a lot of, actually before this came out, I got a lot of letters from people in Poland. And
Wow.
they've been following this a lot because, John Paul, so that's a big thing there.
Oh, that is interesting. Right. I think I'll go ahead and get us started.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Maggie, and I'm the Marketing and Outreach Manager at City Bookshop, a woman-owned, community-focused independent bookstore located in the heart of Washington, D.C., just a few blocks away from the U.S. Capitol building. We are so excited to be with you all tonight. And before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items. There will be time for questions at the end of the conversation. So if you have a question for Allison and Lauren, please put that in the Q&A box so that we can easily see them. We would love for you to keep the chat feature for your general enthusiasm, so make sure to tell us where you're tuning in from. Also, if you have any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat. My colleague Lainey Rose is monitoring that and can help if necessary. Also, if you need to purchase a copy of any of the books mentioned tonight, you can shop on our website, and we do ship anywhere in the country. So, a bit about the book. Why Sinead O'Connor Matters is a stirring defense of Sinead O'Connor's music and activism and an indictment of the culture that canceled her. In 1990, Sinead O'Connor's video Nothing Compares to You turned her into a superstar. 2 years later, an appearance on Saturday Night Live turned her into a scandal. For many people, including the author, what they knew of O'Connor stopped there. Allyson McCabe believes it's time to reassess our old judgments about Sinead O'Connor and to expose the machinery that built her up and knocked her down. Addressing triumph and struggle, sound and story, Why Sinead O'Connor Matters argues that its subject has been repeatedly manipulated and misunderstood in a culture that is often hostile to women who speak their minds. In O'Connor's case, by shaving her head, championing rappers, and tearing up a picture of the Pope on live television. In an era when popular understanding of mental health has improved and the public eagerly celebrates feminist struggles of its past, it can be easy to forget how O'Connor suffered for being herself. This book is for her admirers and her defenders and what they've been waiting for. And a bit about the authors. Allyson McCabe is a writer, reporter, and producer whose work is often broadcast on NPR, and her byline appears in the New York Times, BBC Culture, Wired, and other publications. Lauren Onkey is the director of the Corcoran School of Arts and Designs and professor of music at the George Washington University. Onkey is a longtime educator, scholar, producer, and museum professional. Prior to joining GW, she served as senior director at NPR Music and as vice president of education and public programming at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum. She is the author of Blackness and Transatlantic Irish Identity, Celtic Soul Brothers, an interdisciplinary study of the relationship between Irish and African American heritage. And so I'm going to let Allison and Lauren take it away.
Thanks so much, Maggie. Hi, Allison.
Hi, Lauren.
We were
Thank you, and
chatting
thanks
beforehand, both of
all
us
of us for joining.
NPR vets, but never met before. So this will be fun. Congratulations on the book
Thank
and
you.
incredible reception that it's gotten over the last year. It's really powerful. And, this is not just kind of a moment where the paperback edition comes out, but because, of course, Sinead O'Connor passed, really, you had just kind of wrapped up the book tour, right? Last time around, the landscape is quite different. And since you published the book originally, we had this outpouring of emotion around Sinead that I think in some ways really now wraps around the book. In the epilogue of the book, where you had a chance to talk about this a little bit, you reflect on just how during your book tour, so many fans and people came to you with outpouring themselves about what Sinead's story meant to them. Um, and you were talking about how that helped you a lot after she died, which was an intense kind of thing for you. Um, and you said that these interactions, even a simple "how are you," showed me that our most painful, unexpected derailments can also bring about, as Sinead called them, rerailments, realignments that put us in deeper connection with ourselves and others. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that idea of rerailment, for you, for the way you approach Sinead O'Connor's story. It struck me as a really useful and powerful way to think about the whole project.
Thank you. Well, I think probably to understand how to approach the question, which is a great and big question, I have to kind of go back to the origins of the book. I've started this whole process really in 2021, January of 2021, researching an entirely different piece. And I happened to stumble on some videos about Sinead O'Connor, and it got me thinking, like, what happened to her? Because I didn't approach the book as a lifelong Sinead O'Connor fan. Like a lot of people, she'd kind of fallen off my radar. Of course, I was aware of Nothing Compares to You. I knew she had her hair shaved. I knew what happened in '92 on SNL. But then after that, like, I didn't really 100% keep up with what was happening with her. So it started from a position of curiosity. But as I started to investigate that question, I just was really shocked. I'm not easily shocked. I was really shocked about how often she had been right, not just about the child abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, but about sexism and racism and homophobia and the music industry and so many issues, and how often others had been wrong about her. The other thing I was really shocked about was that she kept making so much wonderful music that just never came to me, even as a music journalist. I wasn't really aware of it. And that began this process of sort of understanding, well, what did happen? That was the start of the book. I should say something about the title, Why Sinead O'Connor Matters. So this is a series from the University of Texas Press. Why so-and-so matters. The so-and-so is the artist. They're designed as small books that make big arguments about artists whose legacies have perhaps been like underreported or misunderstood in some way. So it seemed like a very natural fit for the work that I started to do in terms of recontextualizing, reframing Sinead. I also had the chance, because her memoir was about to come out, to report that story for NPR for Morning Edition. And so I interviewed her for that. And when you do stories for NPR's national news shows, as you know, you have a few minutes on the air. So the idea is to try to pack in as much as you can into sort of like a miniature documentary. You've got the artist interview, you've got interviews with other people about the artist, you've got archival material, you've got music. But even as I interviewed her, I already knew, that there was a much bigger story than I could possibly tell in a few minutes on the air. And so I pitched it to that series, and that's how the book started. That said, for me, it was really a process of reckoning, because as I got into researching about Sinead, I started to think about, where did this coverage come from? Other journalists, where did the reaction come from? The culture. So the more I got into it, the more I realized I was talking about Sinead, but I was also talking about the culture, and then ultimately about my relationship to that as a journalist and also as a person. So when I was coming to the end of the tour, already that process that you mentioned had started, where people were meeting with me in bookstores and wanting to talk about Sinead and her music and all the things that she stood for. But that only intensified after she died. And so the work of Why Sinead O'Connor Matters had already been somewhat established by her memoir, by Catherine Ferguson's documentary. Modestly, I'd like to say a little bit with my book, but also that work has been ongoing over the past year as well.
For you as a journalist, when you take on, or just as a writer, why fill in the blank matters, how are you approaching a book even with that frame, or how did you approach that? Do you think of it as an argument?
Mm-hmm. Yes, but I'm a journalist. It was important to me that it wasn't just, hey, this is my opinion. I think my not just my training, but I think my whole orientation isn't like to investigate. I take it really very seriously, because whether you're talking about a musician or something that's happening in the political world, or something that's happening, you know, in what we call hard news. It really doesn't matter. Ultimately, facts are the foundation of what we do, regardless of the specific beat that we're on. And so for me, that's really about kind of like, what is the journalist's responsibility? In every instance, I think we probably are dealing with incomplete and sometimes contradictory facts, you know, and our job is to sort out the truth. You know, it's not self-evident. That's the work that we do. And we do that. We have different methods for doing that. But ultimately, we're making decisions all the time about how we present a story. And so for me, I think the honest way to approach it and the orientation that I have was to be really radically transparent with the reader. So I'm not just making opinions, but I'm telling you how I arrived at these things. And then I have kind of extensive footnoting in the back so that if you want to also look at the original sources that I looked at, you may do that and you may draw your own conclusion. I'm not asking the reader to rely on my interpretation without providing them with those other resources.
Yeah, in that sense, right? It's why Sinead O'Connor matters, not why Sinead O'Connor is awesome, right?
Exactly.
Even though she's
Well,
awesome.
you know, she is the more, this is the thing that was hard. The more I learned about her, the more I did the research, the less neutral it was for me to be. You know, I came into it from a position of neutrality, but that started to shift over time as I saw the way that she was misrepresented, going back to the original interviews that she had done, the profiles that had been done about her, you know, TV appearances, all kinds of archival material. I started to really kind of come around to the idea that she was pretty awesome, not flawless. And it was important for me to do that, you know, to also honor her humanity by not trying to deify her.
Yeah. You know, I think one of the most startling things about the book and really useful things about the book as a kind of contribution to our understanding is just the way you very carefully map how she was met with that resistance and bewilderment and mockery immediately, it seems, upon emerging in the public eye. And you make a really indisputable case that she was perceived as a threat. She was received as a threat on so many fronts. Which again, it was like, I'd lived through the time, but when you think back, it's like, that must have taken a while to unroll, right? No, it hit her really instantly. And I think your very careful archival work really shows us that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of the nature of that threat. What were the kind of central characteristics of that sense of threat that various audiences had? It's so important about the way women are received in the culture and in pop culture and music in particular, but also what celebrity does, right? That concept of celebrity. So I think that's so important in the book.
Thanks. I think, you know, it was important to kind of put it in an historical frame because many of these articles that I went back to now as my current self, I probably read, you know, at the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, and didn't pick up on any of these problems that I see now. I think part of the reason is because the gatekeeping was invisible to most people. Like you turned on the radio, it was like monoculture. It was like whatever the station played. You know, you picked up the magazine, it was like whatever they covered. You didn't really necessarily see that as a viewpoint, as an editorial decision. I mean, there at that time when she was, you know, 87 was when her first album comes out. So I could probably count as many people who are watching today on my, you know, one hand, like the number of female artists, you know, who were in the rock and roll canon at that point. It was a very small number. And her record label really saw her, I think, more in a sort of pop princess lane because she was so young and she was conventionally beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
And even though she was an artist and was writing these songs, you listen to them now and you're thinking many of these songs on the first couple of records, she was in her teens when she wrote these songs, like Troy, you know, it's a good example. The depth of maturity she had as a songwriter and, you know, the singularity of her voice. I don't think there was a great deal of confidence in the industry about how to run with that. So they kind of wanted to put her in a certain lane and she resisted from the start. So I think immediately, you know, when she's working on that first album, she's making a decision that she doesn't want to be marketed that way. And that was what led to her cutting her hair, you know, wearing combat boots and, you know, not wearing short skirts and that sort of thing. So that's like straight away. She fires the producer they've enlisted to work on the record because even though he's well respected, I won't fucking curse. She calls him a blah 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 old hippie because he wants to make her sound like Van Morrison, you know. And so she just takes the reins, and it's extraordinary. She's also pregnant with her first child, and she doesn't. They're telling her, "Look, motherhood is incompatible for the kind of career we envisioned for you," and she's just like, "No, it isn't." So I think from the get-go, there were these kind of things that she was setting up because she never wanted to be a pop star. She always saw herself as a protest singer in the vein of somebody like John Lennon or Bob Marley or Bob Dylan. And that lane didn't exist. She was creating that lane. So I think that's from the start. And then she's very shy in her early interviews. But once she starts to kind of, you know, really be visible in America, her, you know, except for her appearance on David Letterman, her first primetime TV appearances at the '89 Grammys. And when she discovers that they're not going to air the first award for rap because they're citing limited television time, and she knows that's not really true, some of the artists decided to boycott. She showed up because she was scheduled to appear that night to perform, but she's got Public Enemy's logo dyed and cut into her hair. So, you know, right from the start, she's going to use her platform to make the kind of statements that matter to her. And that is very threatening. So by the time SNL comes along, we've got a couple of years of that already under our belts. And that's kind of not the first straw, but sort of the last straw in terms of sort of the, I would say cancellation, but we're not really canceling her because we're sort of obsessed with her. We just start to recast her in a different light, not as an artist, but somebody who's sort of unhinged.
It's as if really, and I'm thinking about both she really sees the music industry. Tell me if you think this is right. It's like she sees the music industry as a very, very young person, very early in her career, as an institution, as having kind of like institutional power that she wants to resist, you know? And I'm thinking that there's parallels there. She recognizes the institutional power of the church that, you know, sort of sanctioned so much abuse. Like she seems to be able to see not the industry only as a kind of an individual jerk, but oh man, this is a system I'm now stepping into, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of remarkable that she can have that kind of incisive thought. I mean, it's erratic a little bit. I see it, I don't see it.
Yeah, you can see me reacting as you're saying this, because I think the thing about Sinead is that she kind of does and she doesn't. You know, when I asked her about this, you know, her response was, I just wanted to be heard. And I think to some extent that was true, but I think, I don't know if I would call it naivete so much as just like, she's determined, you know, she's determined to be heard. You know, it's not that she doesn't understand how the industry works. I think she's just deciding like, I'm just going to do my thing, knowing it may not last forever. I think that's important to point out, you know, and so I think that like, she thinks I've got this platform for right now, I'm going to use it. You know, I'm going to use my voice, not just to talk about my own experiences, but to be a platform, to be a voice for others. And that's what she does and actually continues to do long after SNL. So I think that, you know, the difference is that when she does her later work, she's not really on major labels anymore. She's self-releasing her music and she has a lot of creative control, but she also is coming up against this problem where whenever she talks to press and she wants to talk about the stuff that she's working on or the things that are going on in the world, they want to recenter the discussion on Saturday Night Live. Why did you tear the photo? Do you have any regrets? Would you do it again? And she's sort of like, it keeps getting pulled back to that.
It's interesting you said there that she had a sense for as long as it would last. Do you feel like she had a sense that that she knew the risk of certain actions would sort of shut things down, or she just didn't see maybe a music career as a long game?
Well, that's okay. So this goes to the question that you opened with about the derailment.
Yeah.
You know, I really think that for her, she came to a place in thinking like she does not want to be a pop star. When Nothing Compares to You took off the way it did, I think that there was some degree of conflict about that, because on the one hand, it did make her into this global superstar. You know, on the other hand, that was both great and horrible for her. You know, great in the sense that she was able then to have a platform, but horrible in the sense that there was even more pressure on her to keep producing that kind of hit, you know, and to be quiet and to do the kinds of things that are required of superstars, which at that time, especially, which was just basically shut up and sing, right? And so you see her not doing that. So I think that she kind of had an understanding that, excuse me, just a second, Siri is listening, and I'm going to close Siri. It's starting to prompt me. We'll hear from Siri in a minute. I
The
gestured
overlords are
too
listening.
dramatically. I think that she's coming to a place where she's thinking, I don't want to do this. And the evidence of that is there are a lot of, you know, if you interview enough musicians, as I have, you know, there is a period of time usually when they have a kind of commercial peak, right?
Yeah.
And then many people say, oh, I never really wanted that anyhow. But I think in her case, we have a lot of evidence that that was always true. And one example of that is after she has this massive, massive record, 1990, I Do Not Want What I Haven't Got. Instead of following with a repeat of that or something really similar, she puts out a collection of show tunes and standards. Am I Not Your Girl? You know, so I think straight away, that's not really the move that you would make if you're trying to build on this sort of pop superstardom. And then she makes the decision to go on Saturday Night Live. Now, what people don't know is in the first set, she performed a song from that album, which was Success Has Made a Failure of Our Home. But on the second, she decided to perform a song that wasn't on that album. And that was Bob Marley's War. And that was something where she changed a little bit the lyrics of that song to address the evils of child abuse, and tore up the photograph of the Pope, Pope John Paul II, to call attention to the child abuse crisis in the church. So, you know, a lot of people felt that that had derailed her career, but she often said, and not just recently in her memoir, that it re-railed her career, because what it did is it took her off of that sort of pop spotlight and brought her back to, why did she make music to begin with? And from there on out, she's making the music that she wants to make, and she's not making the music that is sort of engineered to be a pop chart hit.
You know, you write so well in the book also about music journalism and the history of music journalism and the way it sort of has engaged gender and race as well. And also this kind of mythos around kind of rock as rebellion, and, you know, the way Rolling Stone or even Hot Press in Ireland are, you know, we're the rebellious folks, right? And then these are also the journalists that reject her or mock her. And the book really, for readers, you know, I think that mapping of the rock press here is really, really good. You've got, oh man, the stuff that Legs McNeil writes about Sinead O'Connor. And you throughout the book, I think you ask these questions of the reader that are so important. You said, have you ever seen a profile of a male artist by a rock journalist that involved ignoring their music completely while infantilizing them, commenting extensively on their manipulative personality and seductive appearance, and expressing concern that inviting the artist to hang out with their exes is going to incite jealousy? Name one where the profile ends with the journalist imposing his musical tastes on the artist, then taking him on a flirtatious taxi ride, and then complaining about the journalist's failure to get laid. I mean, that's some great.
I've never done pieces like that.
So my answer to those questions is I can't name any, right?
Yes.
But you really go hard on that point throughout the book. And I admire you for doing that. I think it's really important work there. I wonder, sorry, that was like a fangirl moment and not a question. But my question is kind of, did you kind of come to that conclusion about the history of rock journalism, particularly by doing this work? Was it a point of view you had and this really kind of underscored it? I guess I wonder, you know, where did this story fit in your kind of longer understanding of the way that rock journalism was treated women?
Okay, so now we're going to my derailment.
Yes.
Okay, so first I want to say like Joe Pesci, the week after Sinead is on SNL, he comes on and does a monologue in which he ungenerously treats the, to say the least, the tearing of the photograph of the Pope, and says that if he had been hosting that night, he would have given her such a smack. He would have grabbed her by the eyebrows, making a joke about her hair. I did mention Legs McNeil, but I also want to be clear that, like Pesci, Legs McNeil is really just a person that's a part of a larger cultural thing that's happening. You know, the problem is not just that Pesci did the monologue, which he may or may not have written, which may or may not reflect views that he personally has, but the audience laughed. You know, that was the problem. The audience didn't boo. The audience didn't tell him to, you know, go whatever himself. The audience laughed and applauded. And I think with Legs McNeil, he also wouldn't necessarily have written those articles the way he did if he wasn't thinking that the audience was going to identify, relate, and be excited about it. You know, the purpose of a magazine is to sell a magazine, right? And so there's an assumption about who's reading that magazine. Now, I remember reading Spin during that era. That's where Legs was writing these articles. And I don't know that I would have picked up on it. I don't know that I would have had the consciousness as a teenager to say, oh, this is really misogynist. This is really problematic. I don't think there was very many women that were covered in Spin in my recollection, but you kind of had to identify in some way across gender if you wanted to. You know, I remember kind of like, I was thinking about this earlier today, like I do remember like in 1985, remember when Charlie Sexton had that Beat So Lonely? It was a big hit, that song.
Yeah.
And they put him on the cover and I was like, oh my God, you know, my hair is also pretty vertical. It's a little shorter now. But I was like, I'm going to do my hair like Charlie Sexton. You know, that's my thing. And, you know, I would try to be in a band and I would try to, you know, put this sort of, throw my voice a little low and put the reverb on so I could do Beat So Lonely. And, you know, now it's kind of something we can laugh about. But at the time, that was kind of like something a lot of women did. You know, I grew up working class in Philadelphia. You know, there weren't other girls in my school that would make a band with me. You know, that was something guys did. And maybe you could be in it if you were like considered pretty or dating somebody, but otherwise it was kind of hard. So I think I wasn't at the time when I first encountered that coverage at all thinking about it. Later, many decades later, I should say, to be truthful, I mean, going back and looking at these articles, I felt it was important to name names, but at the same time, for everybody I put in, there were 5 others I could have, you know, who were writing the same things at the same time. I try not to pick on any specific person, but I also didn't want to make the general statement because I don't want people to think I was, you know, overreacting or being sensitive. I do think that it was and still is really hard. And maybe what's even harder than gaining the spotlight as a female artist or an artist of color is how to survive it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yes, that's beautifully put. And I think the book really lays that out. And again, you show it as a, you know, as a kind of whole discourse and a whole culture. I'm thinking about sort of rock magazines and music shows and MTV and things like that, you know, we were all sitting in, right? And so it didn't seem that unusual. I mean, in the book, you transcribe a number of conversations in great detail with Arsenio Hall, which was a huge show. That show was, you know, really important. And I think your patience with that kind of explication is really makes the case and is a great model. You know, given what we know now about the abuse of children in the Catholic Church, especially in Ireland because of Sinead's story, but of course not exclusively. I mean, in Ireland, what you have added to that is that the church had state power. You know, that the power of the church was inscribed in the Constitution. It's just really heartbreaking to read this story and face the ways that she was, that, you know, people attempted to silence her, or just that, you know, this story was hiding in plain sight about the church. And she was so shut down about it. And so as a result, you had to write about trauma, her trauma. And I wonder kind of as a writer, as a journalist, sort of how you worked through that? You know, had you done that before? Was this kind of a new territory to write about an artist at that, in that personal way?
Oh, definitely 100% new. I mean, going back to journalism, I think I think that writing about journalism so openly, I'll start there, was professionally risky.
Yeah.
Writing about trauma and my own relationships, that was emotionally risky. But ultimately, I felt like both risks were worth it because I care so much. And I felt that, it doesn't, just because we talk about something doesn't mean that things will change. But if we don't talk about it, they won't change.
Mm.
And that was the risk that I took. And I think that in a way, Sinead's honesty made me honesty, her bravery made me brave. And so I felt that I needed to just tell the truth. I mean, that's something I really learned from her, which is two things, actually. One is like the power of owning your own story on a deep level, like the whole story. Then there's the other part of it, which is really about telling the whole truth, the hardest truths. And it doesn't mean you have to tell everybody everything. Maggie Smith does a really insightful job of explaining what it means to do something she calls a tell mine, right? So you're deciding which parts to write about, which parts not to write about, but the parts that you do write about for a public audience, to be completely honest, even when it's hard. And that's something that, Sinead did throughout her life. So in talking about journalism, I think that as journalism, legacy journalism, I guess we could say that, has had a lot of competition from things like podcasts and newsletters and social media and so on and so on. They've leaned into this idea that they're objective and neutral and like they don't have a point of view, and no one is buying that. No one really is. I think that you can maybe think about it in a different way, which is transparency. When I did stories for NPR, I pitched those stories. I worked for NPR 10 years as a freelancer, 50 stories. Every one of them was a story I pitched, which means immediately I was invested in that story. But there was never a situation in which I used I in a kind of first person way, or talked about all the things that were on the cutting room floor, all the scaffolding, all the interactions. Was the person late? Were they prepared? Or, did they have anything good to say? Did they say something was contradictory? Did they say something that I had to go back and fact check and find out wasn't true? None of that stuff goes in there. It just, what you see is the outcome. You don't see the process. This book was a little different because I felt that in order to tell the whole story, I had to bring all the stuff in that I normally would exclude. And I also had to create, as Sinead did in her music and in her public statements, a way for the reader to know where I was coming from and a space that they also could feel seen. And it was really hard to do. And there were a lot of times in that process where I wasn't sure, I had doubts, but ultimately decided that the risk was worth taking.
And that, as you said, was a risk, both writing about journalism in the way you did here, but also your own experiences of trauma in your family and abuse, and the ways that you were kind of thinking about that, and the way Sinead's career made you think about that. So
Yeah.
those are two big risks, personal and professional.
But it helped me to understand the risk that she took too. I think in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise. When I interviewed her, I was coming at it as a journalist. So all the things that I wrote about in the book weren't things we discussed. If anything, because I was aware of those things, I doubled down on being a journalist, on being neutral, on being objective. When she asked me questions, shutting it down and redirecting, doing all the things that we're supposed to do. We did talk for a little bit after the interview that I did, just by email. But as I got deeper into the book, I knew that I couldn't continue to dialogue with her. I couldn't write a conventional biography, because if I did, I would be writing it really for her and not about her. So I pulled back, but there definitely were times in that process where, she had no idea that I was writing the book. I never talked to her about that. So, I'd be late at night in the room I'm in right now, typing away and thinking that who could possibly understand this? And the answer was really her, but I never reached out. Because, again, keeping with this idea of being a journalist.
Yeah.
So I think that in a way, that was something I spoke about a little in the epilogue. which is that, all these letters that I received from people and conversations that I have had with people in bookstores and various events, I did have the plan, to go to Dublin and say, look, they were talking to me, but this was all meant for you. And it didn't happen, unfortunately.
Seems like a good time for us to talk a little bit about the reaction to her death, out in the world and also within kind of music journalism, what is left of it as various outlets closed down.
I know.
What sort of struck you in particular about kind of how we all reacted, what the public response was?
I'm going to talk a little bit about, I remember Glennon's Oil posted something I thought that was really smart about this, which is, difficult women, they're demonized when they're alive and sainted when they die. And, I do think that the narrative about Sinead O'Connor had already started to change before she died. Her memoir had been out, Catherine Ferguson's documentary, my book, and other discourse, thinking about her, other people, other artists of her era. So we had already started to have that conversation, but when she died and there was this outpouring from celebrities, that is what celebrities do. That is what celebrities do. They react. It's not that it's bad. It's just that I wish that she had experienced more of that when she was alive, that she was supported more when she was alive. That like many of the people who said, oh, she was what a brave warrior, had themselves been brave warriors, had themselves reached out and supported her. I think that the most important thing in thinking about her legacy is that she didn't always deliver the message perfectly. It didn't always land, but she never stopped trying to spark the conversations that we most need to have in songs like Black Boys on Mopeds, just as one example. I think that's up to us now.
Yeah.
I think that's the way, is that we have to have those conversations. They are difficult. They are sometimes contentious, but I think if we can find a way to listen compassionately to people who we don't even necessarily have to agree, but we have to agree to have the conversation, I think we'll be in a better place. And that, I think, is the way that we can think about her meaning today.
I had mentioned to you when we talked that, after she died, she made the ballot for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and she had never been on the ballot before. But she made the ballot last year. She was not ultimately voted in, so she will not be going in this year. And I, as the intro mentioned, I worked at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I was on the nominating committee. I remain a voter. And I had such a visceral negative reaction when I saw her on the ballot, which is crazy because I think she belongs.
Yeah.
Because I felt the very thing you're kind of describing, which is, man, would it nice to see her on the ballot when she was still alive, like an institution that was, in certain parts of its history connected with Rolling Stone and Jan Wenner and that whole business, and has a lot of work to do in terms of acknowledging women's role in the history of the music. And, to what extent do people grab Sinead as this symbol now of a rebelliousness, wouldn't put up with anything, that's real rock and roll spirit, but like, where were you before? It was I was surprised how I thought I would be high-fiving, and and your book helped me kind of understand that reaction a little bit.
Sinead is brat. I think that, I am a former voter from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I publicly resigned in an article that I wrote for Vulture. I think it's important to point out you and I come from similar backgrounds. We're both reformed academics. And
yes,
back
yes, yes.
I was a GW. I got my PhD there in a program called Human Sciences, which we said was so cutting edge it was cut years ago. But here's the thing. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the part that you were involved in, in education and civic engagement, is really different from, I think, some of the politics around the foundation. So without getting too insider or too in the weeds, I think that within the thing that I was critical of and why I decided to resign as a voter is because I felt that there was really not a lot of diversity. It was mostly white guys nominating and voting for other white guys, and their definition of rock and roll was also similarly very, very narrow. There's just not, there's a lot of women who have been overlooked. There's a lot of artists of color who have been overlooked, both in the nominating process and also in the voting process. But I think it has to do with who's voting. I mean, if these guys were writing about Sinead in the 90s in these terms that I'm critical of, I can't expect them necessarily to come back and think, oh no, she belongs in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Right.
I feel that she was also really critical, I think, in a lot of ways of like institutions such as the Grammys. And you know, people can look this up. It's actually published verbatim in the Los Angeles Times. You can find it online. Her open letter about why she wasn't going to the Grammys after her, you know, 1990 album became huge and was multiply nominated. So I think a little bit my reaction when the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nomination came up was they've been trying. They have, I'll give them credit for that, to address some of the criticism that they've received. But they still have, it really depends on sort of like who's the electorate, you know, not just who's making the nominations. And I think that I was unsurprised by the way that that turned out, saddened, but unsurprised because of the things that I brought up. So I guess this is a long way of saying she deserves to be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Does the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame deserve her? I'll leave that question to others to decide.
Allyson, we have some questions in the chat, so
Okay, great.
I thought we'd move to a couple of those.
Thank you.
Somebody's asking here a really interesting question. Are there any favorite sort of snippets or stories about Sinead that didn't make it into the book?
Yeah, I have a really, really good one, which is, this is around, I want to say 2012. Somebody sent me this video, somebody from the press, her friend took the video. So, you know, a lot of people think about Sinead as being a really very serious person, and she was, and, you know, addressing really difficult issues, and she did. But she also had a very wicked, righteous sense of humor. That's something that people don't really talk about enough when they talk about Sinead. And she was getting ready for this show, and somebody in the audience screamed out from the crowd. I'll say the abbreviation, but they said the real thing. F Joe Pesci. And she said, she takes out her earpiece, puts it back in. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. F Joe Pesci. And she said, oh, do I really have to? I mean, no offense, but he's really not my type. Yeah. And so I think that's a great example of her humor. And that's you know, she was funny and she cursed a lot. She had fun, you know. She I think that people kind of have a sort of very two-dimensional view of her, but I think that she was actually a complicated, interesting, and just very honest person.
That's great, thank you. Another attendee asks, do you see any modern pop artists that carry a similar energy to Sinead with their platform or activism or music?
I do get asked that a lot, and I feel it's a really complicated question. It goes to the question of influence, right? And so when we talk about somebody's influence, I feel that there's a way, especially if that person is a woman or a person of color, that influence is kind of like it sort of like understates how vast and deep the influence may be. It overstates the progress that we've made. That's a way of thinking about it. So I don't know if there's like a artist that I think is carrying Sinead's legacy, but I see it in many artists that they're carrying the legacy. Before Sinead came along, it was really hard to really see a lane for women to express a complicated range of emotions, especially female anger. You know, you see it a little bit after that with a band like Hole. You see it a little bit with like Alanis Morissette has like You Ought to Know comes out on pop radio. You know, this is a big song and there's anger. So there's that. But again, were these people necessarily sitting and thinking, oh, I'm influenced by Sinead, so I'm going to do this? Like, that's where it gets a little bit hazier. I do feel reassured by, for example, an artist like Alison Russell. You know, she can come out with a record where she's talking openly about her trauma, and people aren't like, whoa, let's cancel her, let's weaponize that against her, in the same way that they did with Sinead. So that gives me hope that we're talking more openly about that specific issue. You know, I also can look at Boy Genius as a band and as the individual members of the band, and, you know, being at a show that they did and thinking, oh my gosh, you know, like there are people here of every race, age, gender, you know, sexuality. Like, it's way more diverse than any rock show that I had gone to when I was a younger person. So that gives me hope. But I know there's still so much work to do. And so that work, you know, continues. And whether or not somebody directly name checks Sinead, I think that she did a lot to kind of create a lane for where we are today in terms of the progress we have made.
And you spend some time in the book talking about her back and forth with a younger artist that, you know,
But
she
that didn't go
tried.
so well.
Yeah, that didn't go so well. She was trying to have that relationship.
You know, a lot of her emails to me were, have you heard about this artist, that artist? You know, people who weren't necessarily on the radar yet,
Mhm.
because I think that she wasn't interested in talking about herself. She really was thinking about what's next. And it shows a generosity of spirit to me, you know, at least that's the way that I saw it.
Another attendee asks, the question we all want to know is, do you have a favorite Sinead O'Connor song?
I do. I have a favorite. It's called "The Wolf is Getting Married." I don't know if y'all have heard it, but if not, yeah, you can Google it, and it is the most beautiful, joyous song. And it came from her later records, you know, in the around 2012. This is when this was released, and I often listen to it. I feel that she's just really present. You know, like sometimes
Mm.
after she died, it was actually really hard for me to listen to her music. Sometimes I would go in an interview and they'd play it in the lead in before they brought me on camera. And I just thought, oh God, I hope I can stop crying before they bring me on, you
Mm.
know? Now I can, and I feel differently about it. I just was in Providence fairly recently where I did an event, and at the end, there were four musicians who came up and did acoustic covers of Sinead's songs. Some of them were hits, some of them were deeper cuts for her catalog, and I just found it so moving. And I do feel that she would be honored to know that, you know, a year on, people are coming back to the music and performing it in public spaces and connecting over it.
I think another really important part of the book is the way you map her later career. I mean, for me, I stopped listening, I guess, you know, and that not just because of her, that happens with certain artists, like, oh, I just stopped listening to the latest. Is there one album you'd choose from sort of the back half of her back part of her career that you'd recommend that people really pay attention to if they missed it?
I think one of the most neglected albums in the back catalog is probably Theology. It's actually quite an interesting album because it's two sides. And one was recorded in Dublin, and it's all sort of like traditional sort of Irish acoustic instruments. And then there's the fully produced and sometimes symphonic London side with two different producers. They're the same songs, but just done two different ways. And you're like, wait, why would you do that? But then you
Yeah.
listen to it and you realize she's always been interested in taking from various musical ideas and traditions and trying to synthesize them into something that really is a kind of self-portrait and a personal theology. And I think when you listen to that record, you can see, especially if you know her early work, oh, okay, like here she's bringing all these elements together that she had kind of worked with before. And I think it's an important album. So I would recommend that one as something to go to after you've had a chance to sort of reorient yourself with some of her earlier music. She sometimes was criticized because she was interested in different, like she would do Irish folk music and then she would do a reggae album. People were like, she's all over the place, but she really wasn't. You know, if you listen to it, there are elements that tie all these things together. And Theology, I think, is the moment where you see them really get stitched into something that looks like a tapestry.
That's great. Another attendee asks, what surprised you most about writing the book? That maybe about, I don't know whether that means about Sinead's career or even the process of writing about it.
I think what surprised me most was, I think, just trying to put myself in a place of vulnerability to be able to tell the story.
Mm.
I think that's really what surprised me most. You know, there's a moment that I talk about in the book where after we did all the sort of mandatory questions when we had an interview, she started talking to me about Bob Dylan's influence. And it just could have been the kind of thing where just like, oh, it's done. We're just kind of, you know, chatting, and it's, you know, sort of nice. We both like Bob Dylan. We're talking about Bob Dylan. But I had the sense that she actually was trying to tell me something that was deeper than just a chat. And I started, as she's telling me the story of the songs that she likes most, to write them down, just, you know, like on a little post-it
Mhm.
note. And after we spoke, I created a little Spotify playlist, and I hadn't cleaned my house for a while during the book. So I started vacuuming and I started listening to the music, and I just cried
Mhm.
because it was so overwhelming to me, just the realization that she was trying to tell me not just that she was a fan of his music, but like the way that she understood her life through his songs, which she discovered as a young person who was really struggling. And it was only because I kind of let myself go to that place that I had that moment,
Mhm.
because, you know, you know, I am not really a crier. It's really hard for me to access those emotions. It was where I grew up. That was like a sign of weakness. I've gotten better at it. I told you I cried when her music was played, you know, after she died and I was about to go and be interviewed somewhere. But it was hard for me to access those emotions. And she let me do that. She gave me that gift. And I'm just so grateful. And I'm
Mhm.
surprised because I never experienced that before.
Thank you for sharing that. It also makes me think about, when she plays the Dylan tribute in 92, which is still, that was the story that really hit me very hard again when I thought about that again, and that the plan was for her to sing Bob Dylan's I Believe in You from his first gospel record in 1979, a record that people didn't understand and didn't really believe, but it came from a pretty heartfelt place of Christian conversion, and thinking about the way that the comfort that that song must have given her, as a young person in pain, but also probably trying to find some kind of Christianity. And then she goes into that den in Madison Square Garden and gets booed, and that the lifeline that Dylan's music sort of offered her. How do you process that?
Well, she got booed by half the crowd. The other half was trying to drown them out. But ultimately, it was the noise, you know, that made her.
Yeah.
I Believe in You is meant to be performed as a whisper, and she couldn't do it because nobody could hear her. And if you watch the video, I mean, she just looks so frightened, actually.
Mm.
And you know, I think it's hard to watch. Your impulse is to want to protect her. But at that moment, you know, she decides she's going to instead, you know, do War, the song that she performed on SNL. She's going to double down. I think the moment to her that was most disappointing was that Bob Dylan himself like didn't intervene. Afterwards, she approached his manager. Could he speak out about child abuse? Didn't want to do it for whatever reasons he had. But I think the real moment actually is, even though that happens and she leaves the stage, she comes back out with the group of other artists to do the penultimate song. Imagine like the strength that would have taken, but she does it. And that was the thing about Sinead, is that she was everyone wants to talk about she was fragile. She was tough,
Hmm.
tougher than most people, really tough. And you know, that's just one illustration of it.
So we have another attendee who wants to know about another book from you. If you were to, are there other musicians that you're interested in writing a book about, or maybe even writing another Why So and So Matters? Why?
I don't know if I could talk about why so it so matters, but a dream project that I have, if you're listening and you're an agent or an editor, get in touch. I really want to rewrite the history of rock and roll, not counterfactually, but really showing you all of these people who were there and were significant and don't get talked about enough.
Hmm.
I think you could do that book, you know, just by talking, for example, about Dusty Springfield and Vicky Wickham and Laura Nero and LaBelle, you know, in the period right around 1971.
Hmm.
And I think that that would be a book that would be, you know, just as much of a wow, like nobody really is talking about this thing, but if they did, it would open up like a whole kind of set of questions about what stories get told, who gets to tell them, you know, what we think of as being the history of something is a history of something, but there's lots of other histories, and I would love to tell those histories. So thank you so much for asking. I do have other books in me, and
There you go.
stay tuned.
Um,
God
this,
willing.
this might feel like a pretentious question, but what impact do you hope the book has kind of long term? This isn't a quickie bio thing. This is, really thinking about why somebody matters.
I think we need to have these conversations that she tried to spark. We really desperately need to have them. And if an outcome of it is that people start talking, I'd be really thinking that maybe I had helped in some way to contribute to that discussion. That's what every journalist hopes, right? Is that your impact is that you drew people's attention to something that needs to be addressed. So I think that's probably the most important thing in terms of the long-term impact of the book. But in the short-term impact, I mean, there are people now like you're on, because there has been so much written and said about Sinead. I love it when a reviewer is like, I knew that. Like, great, mission accomplished. She was really an extraordinary person. And I do have ambivalence about not having let myself be open enough to knowing her personally, better. This was mostly, as you mentioned, based on archival research. But after that book went to the press, I've since been able to talk with many people who are very close to her and, fill in sort of things I didn't know and, ideas that I'd had. And, I think that's also deep in my understanding, but now puts me in a sort of strange position of like, I feel like I know her really well, but yet I didn't know her well, I just want to be able in some small way to carry on what she started.
Was Ireland part of your book tour, either in person?
No, I mean, I had intended to go to Ireland. Ireland will still come if you want me. I had intended to go to Ireland, but I didn't make it there before she died. I did not go to Ireland on the book tour. The Irish Times did review the book. So I know that, people knew about it there. And I've, like I said, spoken to a number of people who have read the book, who were close to her. I don't know if she read the book. I never had a chance to talk to her about it. I didn't ask her to read it. And I think that would have been sort of weird to me and awkward and not necessarily appropriate. I think that I would hope that if she read it, she would realize where it came from, it came from my heart, but I didn't want to put that on her. So put a blessing on it. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, your good journalism chops there.
Mm.
I mean, we've talked a lot in this hour about kind of Sinead in a sort of popular music and celebrity kind of context, but there's a whole nother conversation to be had about how she was received in Ireland, and the ways that her story couldn't quite be heard or faced as it came out, and the outpouring there last year was really powerful. The way that people responded and that her music really helped a lot of people tell their own truth.
Well, I think I'm going to send this over to you actually because of your book. I mean, I feel that a little bit Ireland has had this tradition of a sort of agitator artist, we don't really have as much here in the US and certainly not for women. There were early on 2 different album covers, for The Lion and the Cobra, one where she's singing, her mouth is open in song. And then she was reshot in the US with her arms crossed in front and looking kind of demure because she was told by the label that she looked too angry for American audiences. So I think that the reception in Ireland might have been a little bit different. And they did, if you look at how the music later on, fared, I think it went higher on the Irish charts than it did here in the US. And, there are people in Ireland who are really very understandably protective of her legacy. A couple of people mentioned her early manager. His name is Facna O'Kelly, and she mentioned him as O'Kelly, and other people spoke about him as O'Kelly. I kind of made a joke because when I did the audio version of this book, the audiobook, the producer was giving me a note to say O'Calla. And I was like, I don't think that's right, because I remember talking to the people about it. And so I made a kind of joke about, I'm going to call him O'Kelly. That's what we would say in the US. From Philadelphia, we do our best. But, I think some people really like, she doesn't even know how to pronounce the Irish names. I am American. It's true. And a lot of her stratospheric rise happened in the US, and what happened in SNL in 92 also happened in the US. It wasn't really necessarily received the same way there. I wonder if her coming out as a priest a few years later was more shocking. There's
Probably.
lots of different
Yeah, yeah.
shades in different places, but I take your point for sure, which is the reception of her. She would jokingly sometimes on social media call Ireland Direland, but she made it a lot less dire.
Yeah. Well, Allyson, congratulations. This is great. I, everybody go buy the book, buy it for your friends, and let it take you as a kind of guide back through Sinead O'Connor's music. That's the amazing thing that happens here. Really, what a treat for me to get to talk to you about it.
Well, thank you. Likewise, for sure. Also, of course, to read Sinead's memoir too while we're at it. I think that I kind of see them as hopefully in some kind of, a dialogue. I think that that's the idea. And of course, to listen to her music as well, especially the later music, because it's really a treat.
Awesome. I just want to say thank you guys so much for such an insightful conversation. And we're so grateful for everyone who joined us tonight and for all of the great questions. You can buy the book on our website, ecitybookshop.com, and we have lots of other events and book clubs and all that kind of stuff. But thank you guys so much.